Hello, John. Welcome to the Spiritual Context Podcast.
My pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. I want to start with, I don't know if you know this, the first time I met you virtually was during a Koru meeting. It was a teacher's meeting.
Oh, right.
And what I noticed is right beside your name, where people usually have their pronouns, you had Neti, Neti.
Yeah.
So could you tell us why the Neti, Neti? What does it mean?
I began to, and maybe you did too, began to notice a kind of a distance between the North American mindfulness culture and some of the tenets of Buddhism. And one of the things about North American mindfulness culture is it seems to be really focused on your emotions and your identity. And maybe I'm reading Buddhism wrong, but those are a couple of the first things you need to get over, but this kind of nurturing of this identity thing seems to me to be, it's wonderful. There's just a distance between that and what interests me about Buddhism and about some of my own practices. And so it just became kind of a smart aleck thing for me to do when everybody was deciding they were going to reinforce their identity, for me to sort of go back to the Upanishads and say, Neti, Neti, I'm none of those things. He, she, they. That's what this is about. Is not being those things. But of course it was there. I guess there was a little passive aggressiveness. I will admit.
Well, because I had considered that. Yeah, I had considered doing that, and I was like, yes, because I do agree. There's a certain reinforcement of that which we are trying to transcend, or maybe see through.
Yeah.
But we begin to reinforce it and begins to ossify and begins to become a thing of its own. So what is Neti, Neti, and what then is the true self then?
Yeah. Well, let me just to put a bit of a bow on what we were just saying. I think it's awesome that to draw students in to mindfulness, that you acknowledge and sort of reinforce these issues of identity because and emotion and stuff, because they're so much a part of the students' lives. So as a pedagogue, it's part of going to meet people where they are. And using that as a way of saying, I understand who you are. I understand what you're struggling with, So it's not necessarily a critique in the sense that maybe that's the best way to get the kids' attention. And then once you've got their attention and they've gotten into a practice a little bit, to kind of, take them, get into a point where they can kind of let go of that a little bit more and get to another place. So Neti, Neti is basically this idea that that we could say that it's God. I tend not to use the word God when I think about the absolute or Atman or something like that, because God is a term that I think carries with it the baggage of dualism, the baggage that there's me, and then there's this other thing there, which is God. And that's not exactly what this is. What Neti, Neti essentially is as a way, and actually it can be a meditation practice too, as a way of saying anything you can see, anything you can think, anything that's in this physical world, the ultimate is not that. Or you would say, since it turns out that I, in my sort of ultimate form, am one with whatever that God, ultimate is, everything we see, everything we do, everything you can label, everything you can sort of touch and hear and all those things, that's not it. It's something beyond all of that. Actually, when it comes down to it, it's very much a kind of a Sankhya idea, right? There's the Purusha on one side, which is the pure spirit, which is absolutely unencumbered by anything. And then there's Prakriti, which is all physical existence, including the mind, interestingly enough, and the identity. So all of those things are not part of our deeper spirituality. They're part of the Prakriti that we're trying to convince Purusha it's not a part of, and it can separate out. So whatever you can see, whatever's out there, even your own mind, all these kinds of things, you're none of that. It's Tatvamasi. That's the other one. You are all of that. You are none of that. But whatever it is, it's what somebody like Heidegger would call a disruption. You take people's assumptions about things and you throw some kind of a wrench into it. So it creates a new way, a new perspective of seeing things. And so to say to somebody, you think you're that, but you're not. You're not that. You're not that. You're not that. So when I used Neti, it was basically, a way of saying, I'm not a he. Ultimately, I'm not a he, a she, a they. I'm none of that. And that's kind of what the philosophy is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not nouns, pronouns, not the body, not the mind, not my emotions, not my feelings.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, as you were saying too, is in much of Western philosophy, the line is between body and mind. But in Indian philosophy, body and mind are included as that which is perishable, that which is moving, impermanent, and the spirit, absolute spirit, is immovable,
and
imperceivable.
Yeah, think about what that means. I mean, for Western thinkers, think about what that means. What that means is this personality of yours that you're working so hard to develop and refine and make more spiritual. Ultimately, that is part of the physical. It's not like Descartes, I think, therefore I am. There's the mind and there's the body. No, the mind and the body are all part of the physical. And the physical is what you're trying to release. So at some point, what you need to release is not just the ego, but all sort of identity that's associated, like Ramana Maharshi used to say, but who is thinking that? Who? You're going to push you further and further back. But the farthest point back is to let go of the mind. And so for example, the kinds of ramifications this might have for the notion of reincarnation, for example. Well, okay, if the idea is if you keep pushing back further and further and further back to the source, you get back to a place where your pre-personality, pre-mind, those are all physical, those will all pass away. The real thing is back behind that even farther. Well, gosh, then what reincarnates? And so my sense is reincarnation is a wonderful thought experiment, and it's ultimately reincarnation leads to Advaita. It leads to a sense of non-dualism. If you think about it, work it all out. We can talk about that more if you want to. But this idea of pushing so far back, and I think Westerners, they read this stuff and they're like, what I need to do is I need to let go of the body and the emotions and but really in their heads they're thinking, I just need to get into my deepest mind, the deepest place inside my mind, And Sankhya would say, no, man, you're not there yet. The mind, you can make the mind as still as possible, but the only reason to do that is to then take the next step beyond that. And that is not you. It's not what you're thinking. It's nothing you can say. It's none of those. Like, get back to Neti. It's none of those things. It cannot be verbal, because anything that's verbal must come from the mind. Mm-hmm. It's beyond that. Well, then what is it? I can't tell you what it is. Maybe through meditation, I can lead you to the sense that you'll get some perception of what it is. And maybe if I say something about it, and we've both had the same experience, we'll know what we're talking about. But if you haven't been there, I can't really explain it to you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I want to come back to pick on various threads here, but switching gear just a little bit.
Sure.
The second time I met you was Rochester Fringe Festival, I believe, and you were doing a concert at Kirtan, Eastman, and it was a Kirtan concert.
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit about what Kirtan is and about your band and the concert there?
Well, again, it's Western Kirtan, right? Because we're doing what we were doing is something that I would say has probably been made most popular in North America, the UK, and Europe by Krishna Das, right? Who is he's a guy maybe, Krishna Das must be, I'm 67. He's probably 77. He's about 10 years older than me. Came up in the late 60s along with Ram Dass and that whole movement. He's kind of the guy who in the 90s really brought this notion of like singing mantras along with a harmonium, but using harmonies that are very much kind of like pop, rock, folk music kind of harmonies to do it. and brought that to popularity. It basically is, I mean, Kirtan can be done. Probably there are three approaches when you put an act like that together. One of them is you do the call and response, and that's the one where, you know, the map of that is almost always the same. Starts out kind of quiet, you know. I sing the mantra, you repeat it. I sing the mantra, you repeat it. Then it starts to get more worked up and worked up. Then the tablas and the percussion kick in, and it really starts to rock, and the whole place is going. It becomes kind of very much a sort of bhakti frenzy, and then you pull it back down again into the quiet thing at the end. And so that's the call and response thing. Another one can be a kind of a performance idea, where you're actually sort of performing the piece the way you would perform a concert piece. So in other words, the idea isn't to get the audience all worked up, it's to get them to sort of sit and listen and appreciate the performance. And then a blend of those, which is basically to have everybody sing along with you the entire time. So instead of call and response, you just keep singing the same tune over and over again, and people sort of sing along. And so if you watch those performances, you'll see that often Krishna Das, I mean, I've seen him a couple of times. I saw him in New York. I saw him in London. He's watching the room, and like any performer, when he gets things frenzied, you know, I mean, there have been a couple of times when people were so rowdy that I thought, how long is he going to let this go? This could, you know, this could spin away. This could get away from him here, you know. And he's watching. And when he starts to see the signs, he's done this for so long. He starts to see the signs where this could get out of hand. That's when he decides to pull it back. And of course, if he's going to do a couple of those during the course of an evening, he's going to hold off for the most intense one toward the end, because that's the way all show business is. And so that's the Kirtan tradition. It's interesting. You'd think that it rose up in popularity because of the music itself, that people wanted to hear Kirtan. But the truth seems to be that it rose in popularity because people in yoga studios were playing these CDs for the class. Because there's some Sanskrit there, it sounds kind of Indian, but like in a kind of North American suburban kind of way. And, and people are like, wow, this is great. What is this? And then they would have big yoga festivals that were essentially about yoga and have music in the evening. Why don't we bring the guy who's CD? So Krishna Das, Jayutal, Dave Stringer, Wah, a lot of these people all ended up being within this sort of small sort of subculture, kind of rock stars, making Krishna Das kind of the Elvis of that. So I thought, well, maybe this is something, I could do. I've played music all my life, teach music, and, maybe I could put those two things together and do it. I wanted to do it with that particular concert you did. We had two of them at Fringe Festival. I wanted to do it in a way that it was kind of a listening concert and kind of a Bhakti event, and so we tried that a couple of times, had great fun with it, But it turns out when it comes to Kirtan, most people aren't so much interested in the performance element of it. Kirtan, at least the way I've seen it done around here, when it's not Krishna Das on the big stage, it tends to be a little bit more like a campfire sing-along. And really the kind of people who lead those best are the people who maybe have fairly rudimentary musical skills, but lots of enthusiasm and really like to sing. And I'm the guy who's, well, the singing is fine, but the musical skills part of it ended up not being the best match of my my enthusiasms with what was maybe best for the music end of it, or the crowd's end of it. So we did okay, but I decided to sort of turn my efforts, musical efforts, in a different direction. I think
it's interesting because I see exactly what you're saying, the three ways you mapped Kirtan. And I had not mapped it that way in my mind, but that's exactly right. And maybe you could speak a little bit more about specifically the call and response, because it has the element of bringing up the energy, dynamic,
right,
frenzied energy, like you said, and then leading to the stillness. Now, going back to Sankhya, Prakriti, and Purusha, it's like you could say that the energy is the Prakriti, and it's brought to a height, and then you're dropped into Purusha. So maybe you could speak a little bit to that, and maybe also to what was your experience as a performer from that side of the performance.
Well, to take the second one first, I didn't really find doing the kirtan was so much different from most of the other performance experiences I've had. It turns out, for me anyway, I don't really like performance very much. I love music. I love to play. I love to practice. I love to rehearse, that kind of thing. But the thing is, for many of us, at least for me, performance is not really primarily musical, especially if you're the person running the show. You talk about monkey mind. I mean, you spend most of your time worrying about how things are going, what could possibly go wrong, how to manage. So you're basically managing an event. You're about like a wedding planner or something. You're up there supposed to be performing and emoting, but what you're really doing is kind of managing an event. And I suppose if you were in a group that did that, like when I've been with groups that work many nights a week, you just stop worrying about managing it because it's just on autopilot. It's just going to go the way it's going to go. But when you have these one-time concerts, you spend a lot of time doing that. So for me, all performances are basically that. There's the musical element, which the audience sees. But in my mind, what's happening is the management of the event. And so from that point of view, the kirtan thing was not so much different. I mean, I wasn't having a bhakti experience. I was managing the bhakti experience, right? It's kind of different. But the other you were talking about, I mean, it might be worth going to the model that was set up by Vivekananda about the different sort of approaches to enlightenment, right? So famously, in lectures at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, he said, there are really sort of four approaches to enlightenment, right? There's yoga, that's meditation, right? And then he says there's bhakti, that's worship. That's really what the kirtan is about. And there's jnana, which is, more the academic, the philosophical end of it. You can get to enlightenment simply by thinking your way there. And then there's karma yoga, good works, so it's a slow path, but, it's in fact, the path that Krishna seems to endorse, in the Bhagavad Gita. So there are those four. He probably should have added a fifth, and we can get into this later if you like, which would be sort of hatha/tantra. There may be reasons why Vivekananda didn't include that, some having to do with some embarrassment about tantra and tantric procedures, some having to do with the fact that he tried hatha and rejected it, and so kind of, I would say, he swept it under the rug. But all of these are ways of trying to get to some to whatever we may think is enlightenment. Now, what enlightenment actually is, that's a real good question. And if you're a Sankhya person, or Sankhya plus Advaita or something, you would say, well, I can't really tell you what enlightenment is because it's so beyond the mind that all I can do is kind of point to it and hope you find it. But there are all ways of getting there. And so the bhakti thing, so the question is, what fuels the movement toward enlightenment? So in the case of yoga, it's meditation, and ultimately, if you follow Patanjali, stillness. We try to get the mind as still as it can possibly be, and hope by, the old metaphor is, if you take a glass of water and it's got dirt in it, if you swish it around, you can't see through it, it's brown. But if you let it just sit, all the elements move to the bottom, and all of a sudden, the water becomes clear. And so the metaphor is that our minds are like this, and if we let them sit and everything settles to the bottom, we can see something that we couldn't see before. So in my meditation practice and my teaching, I say, when you get to that point and you see what it is you couldn't see before, then we can talk about other things. Until then, let's just get the technique, and everything else is just guessing. So that's yoga. What does bhakti try to do? Bhakti is fueled by the emotion. It's like, well, let's use our emotions to power us there. Let's get ourselves into the almost a kind of a frenzy of worship, and maybe that will get us to that place where we come outside of ourselves and into something greater than just our own individual concerns. Jnana is, let's think about this. What are the concepts that are involved? Can we, Shankara, can we reason our way there? And just keep thinking these thoughts until all of a sudden that light goes on and we're like, bing, oh, I get what this is, right? And so jnana can get you there that way. And, karma yoga is, do good works with no hope of getting any credit for it. You're not really, you're not donating money because you want it to be called, was named after somebody, like a stadium or something. But you're doing it because you want to do good, and you don't really care that anybody knows. And it's that selfless act that does. Hatha, the fifth category, really has to do with using the body. So, the hatha techniques, the best we can tell, from the best scholars can tell, really come from this notion of trying. It's almost a health kind of concern. So the hatha guys, mostly guys back in the day, I mean, that's the way, sorry about that, but unfortunately, that's the way it was in India. Their idea was this enlightenment thing, it's going to take a long time. It might take longer than this body has got. So let's figure out some ways to make this body last longer. What if I could live not 60 years, but 80 years, not 80 years, but 100 years? And so, the postures are all designed as a way of kind of healing the body, treating the body, so the body can live longer. So you've got longer to spend in meditation to get enlightenment in this lifetime, and not in the next. And part of the hatha, so hatha is about keeping the body healthy. But within that is the Tantra tradition, which is about using the body, the sensations of the body, to power you toward enlightenment. So whenever you hear discussion of the chakras, of energy in the spine, Kundalini, that's all part of the Tantra tradition. But, because one of the most powerful sensations we can have in our body is the sexual one, that's also something that they tried to harness. Well, it doesn't take long for something like that to go wrong, as being perceived as going wrong. And so that's kind of what the burden that Tantra has carried throughout the centuries, is that it's people who don't like it think it's just all about, being sexual, and big bacchanal or whatever. But so those are the five. And so to get back to your original question, so the Bhakti thing and Kirtan, that's what that's about. It's about a heightened worship experience where the music and the excitement of the music and the singing and all of that brings you out of yourself. And then hopefully, having had that experience of being out of yourself and into this bigger sound around you, and the whole group of people that are there, and everybody's so into it, a little like Pentecostal religion or something like that. You're sort of out of yourself. And then when you come back down to silence again, it's a different kind of silence than before. Now it's this, and you hope to maintain something of it being out of this, my individual narrow concern, into something grander than that. So I don't know, that's been my understanding of it anyway.
Mm. Yeah, and it reminds me of the word ecstasy, which literally means to be beyond yourself, to stand outside of yourself. And that's kind of the vibe, would be the right word maybe, in these Kirtan performances. I attended Krishna Das's performance in Atlanta and did a retreat with him. And it's very much the whole room. He's conducting the whole room, the energy of the whole room, very much so.
Yeah, well, most musicians do. And he's got an idea of how to present it. Again, for him, I think for him, he can kind of get into the spirit of it without worrying about managing the show, because he's done it so many times. Yeah. But still, there's always an element of that there. This is one thing, in my teaching about the history of rock music, that's, history of music generally, that people, you're not supposed to see this. This is the look behind the curtain. But almost every performer is managing the audience's experience. The audience is meant to think that they're just expressing the way the music strikes them. But I wouldn't say it's an illusion, but it's part of the presentation. If somebody gets up and just sings or just plays any old way, the way they're feeling, most people will see that person as an amateur, and they won't be very effective. It's a little bit like a stage whisper. If you really whisper in a stage performance, nobody will be able to hear you. So you have to have a whisper that sounds like a whisper, but that's audible all the way to the back of the auditorium, right? And so, most performance is a kind of stage whisper. So it's less and less staged the more it becomes a natural thing for you, and that's what I mean about Krishna Das. Mm-hmm. But you're always managing the audience, and even if you're a priest managing a ceremony. I mean, Easter, especially in the Christian tradition, if you do the midnight service on Saturday night, there's a lot of theater in that. And that's good. Who knows whether the priests are feeling it the same way that the crowd is, but so long as the congregation is feeling it, we're okay.
Yeah. And I was exactly thinking of the same thing. I know priests and others who work at chapels, churches, and specifically at a nursing home. And for them, going to Mass is very much taking care of everyone. Are all the elders okay? So it's not that they're able to be fully devoted as they would be if they were just sitting in a pew, but they're really managing for everyone else, taking care of the experience, curating the experience for everyone else.
And Krishna Das says he's a master at that. I have to say, probably noticed he's not a particularly philosophical guy. Neem Karoli didn't talk a lot. And when he did, according to Krishna Das, although he likes to tell stories, when he did, it was usually some sort of like one-liner, So there's not a ton of Vedanta philosophy that goes with it. It's almost always, at least according to, Jai Uttal and Krishna Das and those people who were sort of around Neem Karoli Baba back in the late 70s. The ideas, or I guess late 60s, I guess it would be, is that it was just about love, and to be in his presence was to feel this intense love and never to have been looked at or loved in that kind of way before, a kind of a presence and all that kind of thing. But, he has said some of the things that have stuck with me the most. And, I've done a couple of those online courses with him. And at one point he said, I'm talking about his Kirtan practice, which for him mostly happens when he's not on stage. It's every day he sits down and he does it, and he's not doing it for an audience. He's doing it because that's his mode of, it's his practice. He said, when it really comes down to it, there's nothing magic about this. If you think this is going to be magic and there's going to be fireworks every time you do it, you're going to be disappointed pretty quickly. The thing about it is, you just have to do the practice. Do the practice every day. Don't expect anything of it. Just do the practice. And he's talking about Kirtan, but you can say exactly the same thing about meditation. Just to get off the track just a little bit here. People who get into meditation, I know when I was a kid and I first got into it, I expected magic things to happen. I wanted visions. I wanted, all this kind of stuff. And, that's exactly the wrong way to do it. And we lose a lot of people because when they figure that out, then they're done, because they're chasing something. They're chasing an experience and all that. To just sort of paraphrase Krishna Das, no, that's not what it is, man. You just do the meditation every day. Every day. Don't expect anything. Don't be chasing an experience. Just let happen what's going to happen. Don't be pushing it. Don't be like trying to measure it all the time. Just do it. And if you can't do that, probably it's not going to make much of a difference in your life. You either commit to it as a lifestyle and as a regular thing and just let it flow, or not exactly forget about it, but it's just not going to work for you.
I think I remember it was Krishnadas who mentioned this in his own experience. He was in India and Maharaji had passed away, and he was talking to one of the disciples and he was feeling low. Krishnadas was feeling low. And this disciple says to him, you just want candy all the time. Yeah. Like a child wanting candy. We hanker after that high experience and we chase after that. And that's exactly the desire, attachment that we are trying to undo. Right. But keep reinforcing that within our practice itself.
Well, we have to remember that, Krishna Das, at that time, he would have been like 20 years old, 22 years old, and maybe it's the perspective one gets when you sort of get into your late 60s, but some of these kinds of truths or understandings that we talk about in this tradition, they're not always useful at all stages of life. Like some of the things, you would say to me, like, well, what is your spiritual practice? What are your spiritual beliefs? What do you think is important? I can tell you those things, but I'm not telling you I think it's the right thing for somebody who's in their 20s or 30s to be thinking about right now. I mean, we do have these ashramas. We do have these stages of life where certain things are more appropriate, and certain things seem to make sense because they jibe with our experience. If we go through our lives, I'm 67 years old. I think I've been paying attention most of the time. Certain things are going to seem a certain way to me at this point in my life that if you tried to tell it to me when I was 27 instead of 67, I would have said, no, it doesn't work. It's not very useful to me, So, when he talks about that, or anybody talks about that, it's probably not such a bad idea to think about, well, how old was that person when they had that experience? Because you think because Krishna Das is, in his 70s now, that every time he tells a story, it's like the 70-some-year-old Krishna Das experiencing that. But no, it was the guy who, when not too many years after that, would struggle with drug addiction, and this kind of thing. I mean, the guy went through a lot of different kinds of things, as do we all. But I think that my topic sentence is, not all of these things are appropriate for all stages of life. So, do you mind if I go on about this?
Yeah, of course.
More?
Yeah.
So I see Ramana Maharshi is around here somewhere. There he is. So they're the idea with, I guess you would consider Ramana Maharshi to be a jnani in the sense that he's not really advocating a particular yoga practice or bhakti practice, but it's just, you got to get your mind right about this kind of thing. He's always asking the question, who are you? What is the you behind the you? This kind of thing. Well, what it really comes down to, I think, with his thinking is you've got to release the ego. Well, that's fine. But I don't know that most of our students, your students here at NASMIs at the University of Rochester, Eastman, I don't think I would advise them to give up the ego just yet. I could say from my own experience, the ego powered me through many decades of, success and put me in a good position financially so I can sit around and think about these things in my life. If you're going to really take that seriously and really sort of give up the ego, you're going to have a hard time making a living. You're going to have a hard time paying the bills, all these kinds of things. Maybe it's not the time for you to be doing that. Know that there is such a thing as that, and know that at a certain point in life, a lot of these things that you're accumulating, you're going to have to sort of distance yourself and detach yourself from. But, if you're married, if you've got a career, if you've got kids, you kind of have a responsibility to invest in this ego thing, because it's what powers you through that stage of life, the householder stage of life, So not everything is appropriate for all people. So, I see over there the Yogananda Autobiography, Yogi, a key text in my development, But a lot of the things that Yogananda was talking about are so much clearer to me at this stage of my life than they were when I read that book as a teenager. As a teenager, all I saw was the miracles and the wonder and the exoticism of India, and all that kind of thing. And so that's the part that appealed to me. But now, some of the things he said, it now reaches a different part of me that maybe wasn't available at that time. And so I think with all these things, it can be age appropriate, not age appropriate so much as it resonates more. The German poet Goethe said, well, he lived a long life and he wrote a lot of stuff. So in Germany, in German-speaking lands, Goethe is sort of like their Shakespeare. There's always a Goethe quotation you go to, right? And because he lived so long and wrote so much, you can basically find one for all occasions. But one thing he said somewhere, I think it might be in the Italian Journey, and he said this late in his life, he said, life is like going up a mountain and looking down at a valley. And as you go up the mountain, the mountain being age, as you go up, you get a different angle on the valley. And none of these angles is the wrong angle. They're just different angles. And when you're here, down at this point on the mountain, you really can't see it from where it is up here. When you're up here, you can't really see it from down there. You can remember what you saw when you were there, this kind of thing. He said, that's kind of the way it is. That it's not about being right, being wrong. It's just things look different at different stages of your life. And that's true about all the stuff that we talk about, the sadhana and all the rest of it. It looks different depending on where you are.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And for someone listening and this has happened, reading a spiritual text, it's important to know that because the right teaching at the wrong time is not the right teaching. So the Buddhists talk about skillful means.
Right.
It's what is the right teaching for me at this stage of my life? There are different stages according to our age, but also according to our psychological development. People may be in their 60s, but not psychologically developed to that point. And according to our spiritual development, right? At one stage of our spiritual development, we may need to learn to fulfill our duty.
Right.
And that may be the spiritual lesson. At another stage, it may be to let go of the idea of duty altogether.
Right. People do tend to confuse commitment with sort of clutching or grasping, right? So the idea of being committed to a path is good. You know, like I was saying, if you don't do the practice every day, you know. But then there is this grasping, clutching, not being willing to just kind of let it happen, wanting to push it. You know, if there's a critique that the yoga guys would have of the Tantra approach, it's that, well, some Tantra approaches, it's you're trying to push the energy. You're trying to push it. Don't push it. Just like, what is that Olympic sport, curling, you know, where you throw the thing and there are the little brushes, you know, and the whole idea is you push the thing, but then it goes forward on the basis of how clean you make the path, right? And I think, especially in Kriya, you know, we would say, no, man, it's not about pushing. It's about the cleaning. Clear the way and let it slide up. I don't want to hear about some kind of raising of the Kundalini where somebody has some kind of like a brain damage or some kind of thing, you know, like in that famous book,
Gopi Krishna's book. Yeah,
that's the one everybody quotes. One book has caused such a fuss, but anyway, you know, we don't want that. Instead, just clear the path, and you know, as the energy rises, it'll rise naturally and easily. You know, so no forcing. But boy, when you're young, you really want to force it. That's the clutching, you know, I want this, I want it to happen now, I want it to happen soon, I want to, you know, boy, you are just digging a deeper hole it's like quicksand. The harder you try to get out, the deeper you sink, you know, and that's a lesson we learn, right? Sometimes we learn like by totally rejecting the entire thing. Because this is a con, this isn't going anywhere, you know, and then only to come back to it later in life once we've got the maturity, to see that it would actually work if I wasn't being so impatient all the time.
Yeah, my teacher used to say, instead of trying to bring the Kundalini to your heart, and instead of trying to open the heart, just become the most loving person that you can become, and the energy itself rises. It comes of its own. It's just like clearing the way.
I don't want to wait for that. I want it now. I want my friends. I want to post it on Instagram.
I want the candy. So, John, tell us about a little bit about your academic work, your research, scholarship, and teaching.
So, I guess not to go too far back, you know, but when I was in high school. Of course, all I ever really wanted to be was a rock guitar player. Or, you know, when I was 5 years old, I was born in '59. The Beatles came to this country in 1964, and I was keenly aware of that. I saw them on TV. I had to have the records. My sister and I used to play the records on a little record player with a nickel taped to the tone arm there, and jump on the bed and sing the songs. All I ever wanted to do was be a rock musician. That's all I ever wanted to do. So in high school, that's the kid I was, and one of the bands that I was into was Yes. And John Anderson, who writes most of the lyrics for Yes, is kind of a cosmic guy, and you can't really sort of pin him down, but the lyrics all seem kind of cosmic. And I was into that. I thought, oh, this is awesome, But the music was extremely virtuosic, and that's the part of it that I really was drawn to as a guitar player. And so I'd heard, from the fan magazines or people talking, that this song Close to the Edge, which was a big album for me at the time, had been based on Herman Hesse's Siddhartha. And I was like, well, I'm going to have to read that book. And of course, Siddhartha and Hesse just generally in the 60s and 70s are much bigger than they are now. So I read Siddhartha and I was like, hey, this is pretty cool. So I read the other ones, Magister Ludi and Narcissus and Goldman and A Journey to the East. And I started to really get into this Hesse thing. I mean, I just, of course, it was very much a kind of westernized version. So then I heard that the next album, Tales from Topographic Oceans, was based on something that came from Paramahansa Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi. Now, as it turns out, sort of my mature view of is not really very much, but it was enough for me to go out and buy the orange book, at the local mall bookstore, because you could do that back in those days. There were mall bookstores. You could get Autobiography of Yogi and Hesse and all that, take it back home, and I read it. I remember the first night that I read it, I couldn't put it down. It was one of those kinds of experiences. And within Self-Realization Fellowship, within the SRF people, you get the same story over and over again. I picked up this book and I couldn't put it down. I must have read for 14 hours straight. Well, it was that kind of an experience. I think I did sleep for a little while. Then I got up and I could have read the rest of it. So he totally blew me away. And so that got me involved in SRF, and I started to take the lessons and learned a bit about meditation and started to, it fit perfectly with the Hesse and Siddhartha and all the rest of it. So it was awesome. So in the meantime, the music career was not turning out the way I wanted it to, because the complicated progressive rock that I liked playing by 1978 or 1979 was going out of fashion. And it was all going back to punk and new wave and a return to simplicity. And I didn't want to have anything to do with returns to simplicity. I wanted the complicated music. So it turned out that I was more useful in music school than I was playing in a band. In a band, I was the pain in the neck guy who was always trying to make things more complicated than they need to be. But in music school, it turned out that making things more complicated was the name of the game. So there I ended up. And, I grew up in metropolitan Detroit. So I went to a couple of schools there, but ended up at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in many ways, because it was close. And, because I was a big fan of the football team. When you grow up in Detroit, University of Michigan.
I went to University of Ohio. Yeah. Ohio State, sorry.
Yeah. Well, so then you know what that mania can be like. But it just turned out that it was one of the best music schools in the country. I didn't know that, but, and I got in the field of music theory and composition. So, I'd always been since I'd done all the complicated rock, always wanted to learn a lot about music theory, because that's how you can put together the more complicated things. And so I was sort of advanced with the music theory thing more than most guitar players I probably would be. And so I fit in at music school, kind of. I kind of had to dial back my hippiness in music school, because back in those days, rock music, pop music was not accepted at all in the early 80s in schools of music. So you had to pretend like you were the other guy. So, I switched over to classical guitar and was practiced very earnestly 4 or 5 hours a day doing recitals and all kinds of things like that. It was really, really great for my musicianship and all that kind of thing. But I had to get a degree. And so I got into music theory, and you start reading all of the stuff. And I got interested in Arnold Schoenberg, partly because, just like any other discipline, back in the 80s and still today, I suppose, but back in the 80s, it was really carved up into types of people. So if you wanted to do Beethoven or Mozart, a guy like me who was a rock guitar player, I did not fit in socially with that crowd at all. They were very sort of, they might have been politically liberal, but culturally very conservative, very color inside the lines kinds of folks. So I didn't fit with them either. The people who did Bach music or earlier, the early music people, they were like the original sort of vegetarian, I don't wear any leather type, they were like totally that guy. And that didn't quite fit with me either. But the people who did complicated modern music, there were so few people that were interested in it. They were taking all comers. And so I fit in perfectly with the Schoenberg, Babbitt. This music is, very severe sounding, and most concert audiences don't really want to hear it. But I really admired Arnold Schoenberg. I still do. One of my important influences. And so I'm reading, he's got this couple of books, but one is a book of lectures called Style and Idea. Had just come out in a new edition in the 80s when I was in school. And a big, thick book, 500 pages, all essays. And I'm reading Schoenberg talking about music. And he starts to talk about all these kinds of things about the musikalische Gedanke, the musical idea, and the way he's talking about it, I'm thinking to myself, I've heard people talk about things this way before, and it hasn't been these culturally conservative, culture in terms of, musical culture, conservative sort of academics that I'm around. Man, this guy sounds like Yogananda. this is like, so I'm checking with everybody. Hey, has anybody said anything about like, spiritual influences on Schoenberg? Well, he was very, Judaism was very important to him, especially after, he immigrated, kind of ran away, had to get out of Germany when the Nazis came. So, at the end is Judaism. See, I'm not hearing Judaism. I'm hearing like, full-throated, like new agey kind of stuff, this idea that the composer can see into into this musical idea which has no physical manifestation, and then their whole job is to make it physical and for it all to have this unity and all that. Man, that sounds to me like a lot of the stuff I was reading when I was reading Herman, Hesse, and Yogananda. No. So it turns out that I, like a dog with a bone, I won't give up on this thing. And I decided I'm going to make this my dissertation project, is to figure out what the underpinnings of all of the Schoenberg stuff is. And I discover that, in fact, this is all true. That in Vienna at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, was a little bit in some ways like San Francisco in 1967. There was all kinds of alternative spirituality things going on. Some of the first texts from the East were just starting to be translated into German and into English for the first time. And these composers were getting hold of it, and they were making it kind of the basis for their aesthetic of organicism and music reaching beyond the physical into a spiritual realm and all that kind of thing. So in other words, hanging around in Ann Arbor in the 80s, this sort of like hippie guitarist in disguise as a music theory graduate student, reading Schoenberg and saying, man, this sounds like hippie spirituality. It's like, no, you must be crazy. I don't think I am. It ended up, you know what? It's there. So I wrote up a ton of things about this. I probably have a dozen articles that deal with the spirituality of this modernism, But I must say, and some people took note of it. But here's the funny thing: it still didn't fit with what a lot of people wanted Schoenberg to be. They still wanted Schoenberg. The image that's created of Schoenberg in that whole era, among scholars, is that it's funny how every time they talk about Schoenberg, you'd think they were talking about themselves. Somehow he's got a tweed jacket with patches on the elbows. It's like, wow, you're talking about Schoenberg like he's a university professor. Yes, Schoenberg's a virgin. Yeah. Where's like the wild-eyed guy that was writing all those? And maybe me as a hippie guitarist was trying to make him look like he was one of me. Who knows? But there definitely was this element. And so a big part of my work has been trying to detect this kind of spiritual impulse, not because I want to find it everywhere and make too much of it, but because I think that in a lot of music, certainly in the Yes music, and I've written about that, progressive rock, it was there in obvious kinds of ways, but also in this other sort of modernism, there was the sense that what Schoenberg's music was an attempt to get at something beyond the physical, beyond the everyday, to get to something eternal. That's where he thought music could take you. And so his job was to try to find that. His model was that the genius, coming out of this 19th century model, the genius is the one who's able to see these things. And the genius is the one who's able to capture them and bring them back to more sort of everyday kind of people. But the genius is often misunderstood. So in his own time, the genius is thought of to be crazy. But as society develops, 50 years on, they say, hey, that guy was actually right about that stuff, but only because they've been, I'm simplifying and having a bit of fun with it, but that's basically the idea. And so, again, it starts with Siddhartha and Hesse and Yes's Tales from Topographic Oceans and ends up with me, writing about Schoenberg as a kind of mystic.
And since you've written about Beatles and others, more popular music,
it turned out that as my career was developing, strangely enough, more people wanted to hear about the Beatles than wanted to hear about Schoenberg. Go figure. And like any academic, taking advantage of opportunities. And I love the Beatles. So I used to dance on the bed listening to those records. Of course, with George Harrison, there's an awful lot of spirituality there, so it plugged into that part of it. But I developed this entire other part of me, which was teaching about the history of rock music, especially sort of boomer rock, So, I mean, if anything, I'm pretty much done with the history of rock music by about 1990 or so. After that point, I've kind of aged out from it personally, you know. And if I'm interested in other popular music, it's the stuff before rock and roll. But that kind of became my thing. I wrote a textbook 20 years ago that we're currently preparing the 7th edition. You know, it's been very, very successful, the book, and you know, maybe 60 articles on chapters on various of these topics we're talking about, and maybe 4 or 5 collections of essays, that kind of thing. And that's kind of been my professional career. But in it, I've tried to integrate this interest in spirituality, and what that, you know, what you have to be very careful, of course, because people don't, you know, it's impolite to talk about religion outside of a, you know, a marked spiritual you know this, working at a university, you've got to be careful. There's a fence around what you can do, and you can't be seen to be proselytizing in any way, shape, or form, even subtly, at any point. So you got to be careful. But you know, so long as you've got footnotes and you've got sources in my business, you're in good shape. So I've been able to survive.
Yeah, I find it so interesting. Autobiography of the Yogi, but also Siddhartha. Those were both. I read both of those texts. Probably Autobiography of a Yogi first, and when I read it, I had this feeling. I would fantasize like Paramahansa Yogananda leaving home in search of a guru. That was my fantasy. I'm going to leave home and go to the Himalayas like him and find a teacher. And I had that fantasy for a long time.
Yeah.
But Siddhartha, I read a little later, and I've revisited that multiple times. In fact, I'm on sabbatical this semester, but last semester I taught a class called Asian Ways of Self-Cultivation, and we started with Siddhartha. Such a rich text to explore, Hindu, Buddhist, and even Christian ideas in the text. And what I found very interesting about Siddhartha is just noticing, like we were talking about before, what of the text resonates with me. In Siddhartha's own spiritual evolution. And so when I was young, reading it the first time, leaving home and then finding Kamala, the courtesan, and I was like, that was fascinating. That was so interesting.
Sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah. And later, his renunciant period, his shamana period, him going through all of the spiritual sadhanas. And that was like, yeah, this is it. And now this time reading him with the ferryman by the riverbank and letting go of his son, that was like, yeah, that resonates a lot. That's what it's about. But it's such a rich text to, in a way, map your own spiritual journey.
Yeah. And Hesse is in a lot of ways describing things that, you know, that we're familiar with from the tradition, right? But he is a writer, so he's able to put it into a story and, you know, make the characters. You like the characters, you know, and so that there's an engagement there that you wouldn't get, you know. Gosh, as much as I admire Shankaracharya, I mean, boy, that's some real dry reading there, you know. So it's, you know, to read some of the same ideas in Hesse, you know, so compellingly cast. I think it's turned a lot of people on. You have to say, for as many people especially the boomers, who read that book or had to read that book in high school, you know, as part of their English class. You know, I suppose a lot of them were moved in the ways that you and I were moved. I don't know for a lot of folks whether it ever went past that, though. They were like, well, that was kind of cool. Like, it kind of like, you know, I haven't had that buzz before. That's a nice one. Next, you know. So for as much as, I mean, that book is, I don't even want to, I have to wonder what the sales of that book are. But it's have to have sold like 1 million or more copies or something like that. Yet, for all that, like, you know, like Yogananda used to say, there's only ever a very small percentage of people who hang on. I mean, it's that way in music too. I mean, of all the kids that I played in bands with in high school, how many of them actually went on to continue playing music, and they actually, you know, like for a living? And actually, I can only think about 2 other guys that I knew the whole time I was playing in bands in Detroit who actually stuck with it. Everybody else sort of peels off. The same way in sports, you know, baseball, football, all the same thing with spirituality. So that all those people read Siddhartha, but most of them kind of peeled off. They probably still have a soft spot in their heart for that kind of thing. Maybe they've got an ashtray or a Buddhist statue or somewhere in the house. They think, it makes me think of Siddhartha, but, you know.
And I also, this was the first time, this time reading it with the students, previously I admired Siddhartha's character so much. And Govinda, his friend, and the listeners who have not read the book, it's an amazing book. And as you're saying, it's these deep philosophies, spiritual teachings in narrative form. But this time, I have a deep appreciation for Govinda. It's for someone who wants a teacher and who wants a path and who's committed, who commits, and is yet open to however the path may unfold.
Well, I mean, so the way I read Siddhartha is that the primary tension is between the life of the body and the life of the spirit. So there's the Kamala, Kamala, there's that. There's the sexual element of it, the life of the body, the pleasures of the flesh. There's the money, the merchant.
Yeah, Kamaswami.
All of that stuff that it's kama. Then there's the, I guess you could say, renunciation makes it seem more severe than it is. It's the kind of wearing out. I mean, actually, to talk about my scholarship and close to the edge, there's the turning point in the book, I think, in Siddhartha, is that moment where he puts his head under the water. And he wants to kill this Siddhartha. He's so disgusted with what he's become. And the fact that he spent all this time having all the things that one would aspire to have. The average person would love to be rich and beautiful women and all that. He's just disgusted with himself. He sticks his head under the water, and then all of a sudden it comes to him, the sound of the Om, and that all of a sudden changes him and transforms him into something else. Well, in this article of mine, there's a moment in Close to the Edge, which I take to be that moment sort of made into the music, where that's almost like this moment where time stops, sort of like in the Bhagavad Gita, where Arjuna says, I want to see, in chapter 11, I want to see you as you are. So time basically sort of stops for a minute, and he gets to go into this thing. Oh, stop, I can't, But so this is the moment where Siddhartha puts his head and the thing opens up, and so I say this is what happens in the yes tomb. But that's the moment, and then that there's the material end of it, and then now it becomes not so much a renunciation. You don't renounce things you don't want. I mean, where's the achievement there? I didn't want it anyway. You just let it go, and he becomes this other. There's this sort of glorification of the simple life, living in a small hut, next to the river, running from the ferryman and all that kind of thing. But in Narcissus, so there's that kind of. But in Narcissus and Gold Wand, it's a different one, right? There's the one of the characters, Narcissus, who goes the way of being a renunciate and being a typical kind of spiritual kind of person. So this, I think you would enjoy this one, because the dichotomy is between, is it, learning and renouncing, or is it living a full life in the world? And so these two characters who are boyhood, companions, sort of go in these different directions and come back at the end of their life. And so again, Hesse kind of taking these large themes, and sort of turning them into these narrative fantastic novels.
Yeah, and it's I can very much relate to that. As we were saying, having read these spiritual texts and heard spiritual teachings as a child growing up, I very much initially thought of the world and life in the world as something to escape. Or something to endure while enlightenment happens. I'm waiting for enlightenment, and I got to go to work in the meantime. And eventually it was, oh no, this is the way. This is the way to awakening. This is the way. So then everything in life, everything in daily life became the way. This is the way. Everything becomes fodder for greater spiritual growth. And I think more in the last few years now, I'm beginning to realize, somewhat maybe still vaguely, I'm beginning to intuit that this is it. There's no way, there's nowhere to get. To even think I'm a seeker traversing a path is already putting a gap between myself and a destination that I'm trying to even think of things as opportunities for spiritual growth. There's subtle limitation there. So I'm running up against that limitation that this is it. This is it. This is the perfect expression. If I only can see, it's not things that need to change. It's just my seeing that needs to be dropped, rather. So for those who are not aware, who do not know, including myself, I'm not very much aware of Kriya Yoga.
Right.
So what is Kriya Yoga? How is it practiced? And why did it speak to you as opposed to other practices or traditions?
Yeah, well, Kriya is probably best known in the West as the method of, or the approach to meditation that's advocated by Yogananda in the Autobiography of Yogi. He's got a chapter devoted to it. He doesn't give away the technique. He, like a lot of people in the Kriya tradition, still believe that the Kriya initiation and the most important part of the Kriya, which is the particular pranayama technique, is best gotten from somebody who's authorized to teach. So you can hear a lot of descriptions about what it is and how it's supposed to be beneficial and all that kind of thing. But it's tough to get the actual Kriya without going to somebody. Now, the internet, there's been a couple of authors who've been less discreet, sort of were never really authorized to teach and got it and then wrote it up. So you can get versions of the Kriya in books that are out there. And that's fine. I mean, if it isn't so much this knowing the technique or not that's important, it's the practice and being able to develop longer and longer meditation techniques. So what is Kriya? Kriya is probably I would say that it's primarily in its goal consistent with Patanjali and the Yoga Sutras, which is it is a technique that's designed to bring you to the stillest possible place. As Patanjali says in those first couple of sutras, yoga is the stopping or the elimination of the waves of thought or the whirlpool of the mind. It is only when you're in that state that you can see who and what you really are. Otherwise, you believe it's what's happening in this world out here. And then then Patanjali or whoever wrote that book, or whatever committee or whatever tradition, go on to explain all the ins and outs of that. But basically, the game is revealed in the first 3 or 4 sutras, and so that's what Kriya attempts to do. But so there are the routines that you learn are basically designed to progressively get you to these deeper and deeper states. It takes time. When I teach meditation at Rochester, I teach a version of mantra meditation, which is not Kriya. But until you can do this mantra meditation routine that lasts about 30 or 35 minutes and do it comfortably and regularly without getting all antsy that, you're bored, it's, this is going on too long, that kind of thing. You have to be able to settle into that. Until you do that, there's really no point in me giving you the Kriya, because unless you're going to start to devote yourself toward like 45-minute Kriya sessions, it's not really going to make much difference whether you're doing Kriya or not. So in other words, long meditations are important. Depth of meditation is more important, but depth of meditation is going to be tough to get on a short meditation unless you've been doing it for so many years you can just drop into that place. So Kriya is essentially a technique. So the goal is consistent with Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, but the technique also draws from Tantra in the sense that the Kriya involves moving energy up the spine, and it involves being aware of the chakras. And the idea, so I mean, without giving away the pranayama, that's essentially the idea. But it's not one in which you're forcing any energy up. The idea is to clean the chakras, or to to make it so that any energy that rises naturally and in a way that's entirely non disruptive in any kind of physical or certainly any kind of emotional sense like that. So there should be no surprise rising of the Kundalini, anything like that. If that's happening, you're not doing the Kriya right. So that's what the Kriya is. I would say the Kriya is essentially a technique of meditation. It was developed by a figure by the name of Lahiri Mahasaya. Shamacharn Lahiri was born in India in Bengal in 1828, and the story is told a couple of different ways. The mythological way is basically told in Yogananda's book that he met somebody by the name of Babaji. It's an avatar who taught him. Revealed to him that he had been his disciple in a previous life, and taught him the Kriya all over again. And Lahiri Mahasaya, as the story goes, said, "I need to be able to teach this to regular people." And Babaji said, "No, absolutely not. People cannot. You can't. No, you can't do that." And so finally, he got dispensation to do that. And so he went back to Varanasi and started teaching this Kriya technique, which apparently, as the myth of it, the mythology, which could be partly correct. I don't know. I'm not judging. I'm just saying this is what the mythology is. Goes back, to the time of Patanjali and back to, a couple of thousand years. Who knows? It's not really important, but it's a pretty effective technique. It really does seem to be, it seems to me that maybe whoever it is that taught him, Babaji, whoever it could be, it may be that somebody or a group of monks sort of taught him this technique, and he uses the term Babaji to represent the tradition, or maybe he uses Babaji to represent the higher self. It's not really quite clear. Yogananda makes it seem like there's a succession of gurus, and maybe he believed that, and maybe other people believed it, but it's not clear from Lahiri Mahasaya what's extant of his writings that that's exactly the way he thought of it. But anyway, the technique seems to have come, I think it came from a tantric, and so he basically adjusted it for the kind of thing that everyday people who weren't renunciants and who weren't, doing this 6 hours a day could do. And so he developed this Kriya technique, and had a lot of students in India, a lot of people that he initiated, one of whom was Yogananda's father and his mother both, who, when Yogananda was born, Lahiri Mahasaya was just in the last couple of years of his life at that time, in 1893, 1894, brought him to Lahiri Mahasaya, and as the story is told in the Autobiography of Yogi, and put the baby in Lahiri Mahasaya's arms, and he said, "This child will become a great, freight train for spirituality," or whatever. That's a great way to tell a story. And like a lot of Yogananda stories, they're very, very engaging, but you're a little bit like, come on, is that really how it happened? It doesn't matter. It's a fun story, but it illustrates a point. So Lahiri Mahasaya is the guy. He develops this Kriya, and then he has all of these, sort of first generation students who he authorizes to teach the Kriya. There are a number of lineages that come directly off Lahiri Mahasaya. And so the Kriya between these lineages is not identical. So I've done Kriya with SRF, the Yogananda Kriya, Hari Harananda, who was a late assistant to Yogananda's guru, Sri Yukteswar. I've done his Kriya. I've done the Kriya at what's called the dynastic Kriya in Varanasi, where I was given the Kriya by the great grandson of Lahiri Mahasaya. There's sort of an unbroken tradition there, and then I've became a Yogacharya in the Panchanam Bhattacharya lineage, and then learned about some of the others as well. And the Kriya that everybody's teaching is not identical. There are differences. And so the reason why this is important is if you get in a Kriya world, people start, who's got the original Kriya? This is the original. You know what, guys? I'm not sure we know exactly what the original Kriya is. What attracted me to the Bhattacharya is as I got into this world, it seemed like the Bhattacharya lineage had been the one that was closest to what Lahiri Mahasaya had taught. And so I did that. I took all the higher kriyas there. I'm able to initiate in that kriya. But as I began to take these other initiations, I began to realize that, first of all, at the very beginning, they all look very different from each other. Not very different, but different enough that you'd say, hey, something's really not the same here. But then as you stick with each of these traditions, and I've taken the higher kriyas and a couple of different ones, once you start to see more of what their kriya is, you begin to realize, oh, they've got all the same stuff. They're just presenting it in a different order. This isn't a difference in kriya. This is a difference in pedagogy. Right? And so it turns out that, some of the stories are that Lahiri Mahasaya himself and Bhattacharya as well would look at people when they came in, try to get to know them, and adjust the kriya to ways that they thought might be most effective for that particular person. So the essence that there is just one and only way that you must always do exactly the same way, this is kind of a fiction. I mean, I can see it's a fiction that people like to hang on to because they want something that seems authoritative in that way. But, as anybody who's taught, that you have a course that you teach, and you get the group of students that you get, and then you begin to modify how you teach it depending on what the students seem to need, what their background is, various kinds of things like that. And so I think this is what happened inside the Kriya tradition. So having seen all of these, I haven't seen all of the traditions, but I've seen enough to know that there really is, generally speaking, one big Kriya tradition. It basically is about stillness. It basically is about moving energy up the spine. Up the spine. The chakras are very important, but it's only a technique. So the second part of what I would say is not only the diversity of the Kriya, and so Yogananda's is one version of the Kriya which is very effective. As you get into his higher Kriyas, it turns out it looks a lot more like the Bhattacharya Kriya and the Lahiri Mahasaya. But at the very first one you get, you're like, oh, he's changed it. Nah, he's just changing the order of things. It's okay. Stick with it, So that has to do with Yogananda. The second part is that I think that people, I want to say this in a way that's careful because I don't want to seem like I'm critical, but people mix up a little bit or conflate spiritual beliefs with meditation technique. So if you go to some Kriya organizations, they believe Kriya is about lifestyle. Kriya is about, beliefs and this kind of thing. And it's true. Lahiri Mahasaya said every day, you should read a little bit of the Bhagavad Gita. And Pancharam Bhattacharya had an annotated version of the Bhagavad Gita, but they were Hindus. It was natural for them. It's also true that Lahiri Mahasaya, had Muslim Kriya bonds, So and maybe you're a Catholic, and it isn't really Kriya is not a spiritual practice in the sense of beliefs and lifestyle and all the rest of it. It is true that people who teach the Kriya advise various spiritual beliefs and advise various lifestyles, yama, niyama, that kind of thing like that. But the fact is that the Kriya is actually just the technique, and you can take that technique and you can make it devotional. Either way, the Kriya is agnostic. The Kriya is basically a technique. And so when I teach it, when I teach the prequel to Kriya, the mantra meditation technique, I basically teach it with no spiritual references whatsoever. What I tell the students is, look, I'll show you some techniques that'll get you to a really quiet and still place if you practice them over a period of time. Not immediately. There's no magic here. This is no magic pill. You want a magic pill, drop acid. For now, if you're going to do meditation, you have to take some time. Like Krishna Das says, just do the practice. But when you get to that silent place, it's up to you what you do with that. And that kind of is where it's sort of like the Advaita and the Buddhists may be kind of part paths. It's like, well, we can probably agree on the way to get to that place, but what we experience at that moment, to me, it seems more like this. To me, it seems more like, well, okay, yeah, whatever. I'm not involved in that discussion. I know the technique, and Kriya will get you to that place, and I think it will probably get you to that place faster in a shorter period of time, by which I mean maybe 6 to 10 years as opposed to 20 to 30 years. It'll get you to that place faster than sitting and watching the breath, because there are certain techniques that in the Kriya that are designed to engage the physiological aspects of the body that will allow it to get into this low idle state more readily. And you can use your own body and the ways that your physiology works to reduce, to get yourself more in a shorter period of time and in a more secure way into this sort of deeper and deeper spot. But the Kriya doesn't say, and when you get there, what you will see is. Now, some guys who teach Kriya do say that, but the Kriya itself doesn't really say that. Yogananda's got his ideas about what happens. That's fine. But that's not Kriya teaching. That's spiritual teaching. And you're welcome to it. That's great. That's awesome. You should do that. But don't get the two things confused. So a lot of times I think people say, well, if I'm going to be a Kriya Bon, I need to be a vegetarian. Well, maybe you need to be a vegetarian, maybe you don't. But that has nothing to do with one or with the other, So that's a long way of saying it. But I think probably, having looked at all of these techniques, it's probably, I think, a pretty fair summary of what Kriya is. So for those, who may be listening who want to get involved in Kriya, I would say, find somebody who can show you the Kriya. You probably should already have our meditation practice of some kind going to sort of start from 0 and trying to get to 60. Even when you do the SRF lessons, it takes about 6 months to get to the point where they're willing to show you the Kriya. But SRF does a fine job with the Kriya. But if you do the SRF first Kriya, I would really recommend that you don't stop there. At least get to what SRF calls the second Kriya, because Yogananda does hold a couple of things back from his first Kriya that other organizations teach on the first Kriya. So you wouldn't want to, he says you could stop there, but the fact is you could stop with mantra meditation if you want to, if you're willing to wait long enough for it to take effect. But if I was going to do SRF, I'd at least get to the second Kriya. And then once you've got that, you've got most of the good stuff that's in the rest of traditions. The Hariharananda tradition from the Kriya Institute in Miami, they have a great program there too. But again, I get into their higher Kriyas. Then the thing about the Bhattacharya lineage that I'm in is some of that stuff that's in the second Kriyas for Hariharananda and Yogananda are already in the first Kriya that we teach. But I can see pedagogically why people might want to separate it out. Because like we were saying before, people want quick results. You give them the whole schmear at the beginning. It's overwhelming. They haven't got enough time. They haven't got enough endurance to get through the whole thing and have the energy to do it. So it could be counterproductive. You could drive people away. So instead, you slow it down, give them a chance to sort of grow into each step. And so that's why I think in some of these, it's about pedagogy, not really about Kriya.
I have a number of questions. Let's see. First, to someone who may be completely unfamiliar with things like chakras and Kundalini energy, and we don't have to go into the entire psychology and all of that behind it, the Kundalini physiology and things like that, but experientially, what is the sensation of these things? Does it feel like a physical sensation, or sometimes people talk about subtle bodies? How is it felt?
Okay, well, let me back up a little bit and talk a little bit about just the meditation technique that the tradition that I'm in generally. When I said before that what this tradition tries to do is get into to use the body, to use levers in the bodies, in our physiology, to induce these deep states. Here's a little bit of an explanation of that, because it ties into what happens with the energy, and whether that's really energy, whether these are really places in the body, or whether they're just ways of exercising the brain. So it turns out that the way when we think about the way our brain works, we think about meditation. We think, it all happens in the brain itself. But we have this thing, autonomic nervous system. And in our autonomic nervous system, the way it's traditionally been taught in medical schools and anatomy courses, there's typically it can be in one of two modes: the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. And the sympathetic system is always referred to as the fight or flight. So the sympathetic system is the one where we're always, our bodies, at least at some unconscious level, are always looking around for threats in the environment, and we react to them. Everybody has had the experience where they've almost stepped on something and they avoided it without even having thought about that it was there. Somehow their body already knew it and directed it, this kind of thing. It's always scanning. It's always on. And then the other, that can switch off, and then you go into parasympathetic, and that's called the rest and, they often call that the rest and digest. And this is when we feel safe, we're not scanning for threats, and now we're becoming calm. And when we're asleep, we go into the parasympathetic. It's good for our health and all these kinds of things. And so meditation is more like the parasympathetic than like the sympathetic. So you want to do whatever cues your body, whatever you can do with your body to coax it into parasympathetic, you want to do. Now, within the parasympathetic, a recent theory, I mean in the last 20 years or so, by Stephen Porges of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, divides the parasympathetic into what he calls the parasympathetic all has to do with the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is one of the nerves that doesn't come out of the spine, but actually comes out of the brain and goes down our bodies. There's one on the front that goes down about as far as our lungs and our heart, and then one to the back, which goes down to about the bottom of our torso. Sounds really familiar from Kundalini, as you know. But the one on the front is called the ventral vagal and the dorsal vagal. So he divides the parasympathetic up into those two kinds of things. And the dorsal vagal is the one that's going to lead to disconnection from the body, shutting down, all the kinds of things that we associate with meditation, deep meditation. So the question is, okay, well, if this is a physical thing, if it's a matter of our autonomic nervous system, what can we do to kind of trigger that without, using a drug or getting ourselves into any kind of trouble, with our bodies and with our sensations and all that. So, as people have known for thousands of years, the key to triggering the parasympathetic system is the breath. And there are other ways of doing it, but the breath is a really, really good one and really, really reliable. And it turns out that when you're doing your meditation, and this is not like exclusive to Kriya, a lot of people talk about this. When you're doing your breath, if you're just watching the breath, if you're just careful to always make the out breath longer than the in breath, you'd be surprised how such a little thing can make such a big difference in triggering a deeper meditative state. It's because, and I have a PhD in music, not an MD. So this is a dopey hippie guitarist talking about medicine. So you want to look all this stuff up and hear it from someone who really knows what they're talking about. But the way I understand it is, on the in-breath, our heart doesn't always beat at exactly the same rate. So on the in-breath, it speeds up a little bit. On the out-breath, it slows down a little bit. That's called heart rate variability. And in our body, the stronger the muscle is, the vagus nerve is what Porges calls the vagal brake. The stronger that is, the more vagal tone we have, the more we're able to quiet ourselves and our heart, because our nervous system kind of knows how to do that. So with HRV, heart rate variability, if you take, let's say an in-breath is a count of 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then an out-breath of 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, I was counting at about a second a count, it's a 10-second breath, 4 plus 6. That's something that most people can do right off the bat. But if they do that, they're going to actually be triggering their parasympathetic, or beginning to trigger their parasympathetic system. And so when I teach my mantra meditation, we begin with what I call basic pranayama, where I have the students do six breaths of 4 in, 6 out, and then 6 breaths of 5 in, 7 out, and then 6 breaths of 6 in, 8 out, and then 6 breaths of 7 in, 9 out. Sometimes I start at 5 in, 7 out. And so by the time we very slowly lengthen that breath. So if I can get it down to where each breath lasts about 20 seconds, I can get them down to like 3 breaths a minute. Man, that parasympathetic kicks right in. Now, if they're monkey minding around and they're like still worrying about problem stuff, there's only so much you can do. But assuming that somebody's is not in some rare kind of excited stage, you can get them down to this point, and now they're really, really still. So what do the chakras have to do with this? Well, so the idea is that if you feel where the chakras are, and you can feel it in your actual body to sort of locate it, but what you're trying to do is use your mind, your consciousness, to feel different places in your body. So if you feel the very bottom chakra, that's sort of down at the very base of your torso there. You can sort of feel that along the spine at that place. Just sort of put your attention there for a minute, and then up a little bit farther, like closer to your bladder. You can feel the second chakra there. The third one you can feel just at about the belly button. The fourth one just at about the heart. The fifth one just at about the throat. And the sixth one either at the medulla, where you can find the medulla by just rotating your neck and feeling the pivot place there. Or you can think of it as, you can think of that spot as being the spiritual eye here. That's the sixth. That's the sixth one. There is also another spot on the top, which, strictly speaking, in the literature, a lot of people don't consider to be a chakra, but consider it to be an important location. Kriya tries to keep, most Kriya lineages, Lahiri Mahasaya's lineage anyway, tries to keep the emphasis on just the six, and not to work the top chakra. This is what seems to have gotten, at least a lot of the Kriya guys think, got Krishna, Gopi Krishna, into trouble, is that the way he was doing it was he was trying to force everything up to the top. And it's not because there was actually energy or an actual serpent in his spine trying to get to the top, but it's because the mental exercise does something in the brain that can cause a certain kind of imbalance. So the way it's usually talked about when we talk about these chakras is that coiled up 3.5 coils at the bottom of the bottom chakra is like a serpent, but it's not really a serpent. It's like an energy serpent. And as each of the chakras opens, and sometimes in some traditions, they try to push the energy through. You were mentioning before how your teacher had said, don't push, just open the door if you can and let it come through its own way. But the energy is supposed to go up the spine. Eventually, over the course of time, you raise the Kundalini to where it gets all the way up to here. And in some cases, Gopi Krishna and other traditions, they take it all the way up to here. And this is called the raising of the Kundalini. And this leads to an enlightenment type experience. The way that we think of it in our tradition is that we don't think of these as being actual places in the body. I think most people don't expect to do an autopsy and say, oh, well, but in fact, they are places where you focus your attention, and we don't exactly know why, but it turns out when you focus your attention in these various places, something's happening in your autonomic nervous system, something's happening in your brain that causes you to gain greater stillness. It's like reflected pain or something. There are certain parts of the body that have no nerves to have pain, and so that the pain will be reflected somewhere else in the body. And so the chakras are like that. They're not really there, but imagining that they're there causes something to happen up here that's really good.
Yeah, I guess one way to think about the chakras is it's like a geography of attention.
Yeah.
And so these are points of attention that can then induce, through induction, certain processes in the body.
Exactly. And in the brain.
In the brain, yes. So for me, in my case, I've had some experiences in the past, and since, and initially it was pretty intense, but since milder, subtler, and more integrated. So what I feel is not necessarily like channels, but just something like an energy rise up. Mm-hmm. Initially, it would feel pretty intense, but now it feels more pleasant, and it rises up, and sometimes comes to the heart area and kind of feels like it radiates there, or sometimes comes and it's not me doing it. It comes around here.
Yeah.
And it's pleasant. It's very pleasant. It doesn't, when it first happened, it was so pleasant that I would have to stop and, sit, or I'd start crying, or, and now it's just pleasant. And it comes up, for instance, if you see a beautiful flower or see some kind of expression of love. And I think in psychology, they're now studying the emotion. I don't know if they call it an emotion, the sensation of elevation. When you see something of moral beauty, you feel elevated. Whereas when you see something that is of, it diminishes you, so you feel degraded. So it's kind of like you feel something of moral beauty, or something of love and kindness in the world or within yourself, and you suddenly feel like, oh.
So what do you think about the idea that, I think the way that people experience the sensations that you're talking about, certainly it seems that they differ from person to person. And I suspect that that's because, do you know the old joke? The guy goes to the doctor and says, "Doc, it hurts when I do this." And the doc says, "Well, then don't do that." It's the idea that it feels so good when it stops. And the feels so good are the sensations that you're talking about. And what's stopping? Stopping is whatever caused that not to be there naturally. You had to do something to allow that sensation to occur. And in every person's life, and I would venture to say, these kinds of experiences are probably more intense for younger people than they are for older people, unless the older people haven't learned anything through age. But I think young people carry a lot more tension and blockage in themselves because they're under more pressure in a lot of kinds of ways. And so if you can find a way to relieve that pressure, all of a sudden something happens. And it feels like it's something that should happen that way for everybody. No, but it happens for you in a particular way because you have particular kinds of pressures. And when you kind of open up the door, all of a sudden the feel of it rushing in because it's been stopped is very, very, it's not so much like it's happening. I mean, I'm sure we all expect it that it's happening in a positive way, but actually it's a little bit like it feels so good when it stops. You take the pain away, and all of a sudden the absence of pain is perceived as pleasure. Right. The absence of blockage is perceived as flow.
Exactly. It could be, and this is how I have, I guess, been taught or have understood it, is that is the natural state. Right. And in our ordinary way of being, it's like we're suppressing that. Right. The pressure is in suppressing that, and suddenly the suppressing of it by all kinds of fears or mistaken identifications, attachments, aversions, suddenly the door is opened, and then, oh, this is my natural state. So this is how I am.
If this observation is correct, or at least partially correct, it means that some of the experiences that you're talking about are ones that are experiences of transition. In other words, they probably aren't going to continue, because the more you do, the more people develop, the less of that. In other words, if that's the release of energy, there's going to be a point where you don't need to release the energy because you're not holding it.
Yeah. And then I think
then you're more into a kind of a flow kind of situation where it's always just kind of there, but not with the same kind of like overwhelming tendency.
And that's been my experience. It doesn't feel as intense. And I think partly what the mind can then say is, oh, it's not there, but no, it's become more integrated, more pervasive. Yeah. And so the transition sensation of pushing it down and suddenly it being released, the transition is not as pronounced.
Yeah. So in the Kriya tradition, or at least in the Bhattacharya tradition, the way we talk about it is, and these are all metaphors, right? We talk about it as cleaning the chakras, so that you clean the chakras, and each of the chakras is associated, so anxiety is with the third chakra, and, love or emotion with the fourth chakra, and, voice or expression with the throat chakra, like that. And you clean those out so that the pathway for energy is open. But those are all metaphors, right? And ultimately, if you've done a good job of cleaning them out, there is no feeling that anything has to pass or be relieved or anything kind of thing like that. You're just there. And the idea is that okay, now that you've got that, now the work begins. Now that you've cleared the landscape, now what? It's a little bit like they say, I mean, this is slightly different, but how does the Zen proverb go? Something like, before enlightenment, carry water, chop wood. After enlightenment, carry water, chop wood. And this is, I think, one thing that whenever we talk about these things, we always talk about them aspirationally. So it's like, yes, well, if I do this, then finally I will get this enlightenment. And my experience is, what I've been able to piece together is enlightenment isn't what you think it is. And if somebody's saying, and I want this, and I would say, okay, well, then what? You got it. Now what? What happens next? Well, it's not look like the dog that catches the car. It's like, well, now that I got it, I don't really know what happens next. I spent so much time trying to get it, and now I've got it, and then what? But, if you're successful at some point, you're going to get it. And when you get it, you might find out it's not what you thought it was going to be. And it turns out life goes on. So it starts to be, then all of a sudden that Zen proverb makes all kinds of sense. It's like, yeah, I spent all this time trying to get this thing, this state, whatever. I feel like I've got the state. It's not quite what I expected it would be. I'm not disappointed, but I thought there'd be more fireworks, or some kind of thing. Maybe I would see Shiva or something. No, none of that. And now I got to go back to work. And that's, what is. So again, when the whole thing is cast entirely in terms of the aspiration towards something,
right.
It's like, well, what if you got it? Then what?
Right. So
nobody asked that question, eh?
Yeah. And I'm going to ask you that question. But a couple of things. One, so for instance, when I feel, as I said, when I see something beautiful or listen to actually beautiful music, devotional music, or not the high frenzy, high emotion devotional music, but more like Gregorian chants kind of music, I feel the resonance within, and I feel the energetic resonance within. I can feel the sensation, and mine is kind of stilled to a certain degree. And there's a heightened sensitivity to beauty, and it's like beauty triggers it. And at the same time, I become more sensitive to beauty, more sensitive to love, more sensitive to stillness, and stillness triggers it. So it's like a reinforcing thing. So the question then is exactly that. It's in two parts. One, how would you characterize a deep meditative state? And maybe that's what you're calling the stilling of the mind. How would you characterize it phenomenologically from the inner subjective experiential description? And the second is, when in deep meditation, when you do arrive at such a state, because the state would then imply it comes and it goes, or at least the awareness of it comes and goes. The state may be permanent, enduring, but our awareness of it comes and goes. When we return, what has changed?
Yeah. So I think the way to think about that, or the way that I think about that, is the more different people you read talking about this, the more you realize that everybody is shooting for this experience that we would call Samadhi, nirvana, moksha. This idea that when you get into the deepest meditative state, everything will drop away, and you will feel a great oneness with all things
Forever.
Well, I mean, until the meditation ends, and then if you really get good at teaching your brain how to do this thing, you can carry a sense of that into your everyday life. And so people will say things like, I go around and now I'm transformed because everything appears to be God. Everything is God all the time. It's like the spirit is rising up in all things. So that's considered to, I mean, I've read it again and again and again. That's the ultimate goal, is that you'll be transformed in that kind of a way. So here's the thing about it, though. That sounds great. And I love the idea of that, I'll take it. But it turns out that if you look at the brain science on this, We have this place in our brain, in the parietal lobe, that is basically responsible for creating a sense that my body ends here and the world happens out there. And you can see, in terms of evolution, why this would be a really handy thing to have, especially in a world where there are tigers and, all snakes and stuff, So, well, it's good to kind of know where I end and where that begins, So we have that. It's a kind of a filter. There's a book by a woman called Stroke of Insight. I don't know if you have read this book, where she has this hemorrhage on the left side of her brain. So she's living on the right side of her brain. And that's the way she sees the world. It's like the filter has been destroyed. And now she lives in that place. So some of the scientific work on this suggests that what happens is that place in the parietal lobe where we distinguish the difference between ourselves and that, it goes quiet. So you mean to tell me that experience of oneness is actually a brain thing? Or is it coordinated with a brain thing, or what is it? Well, another one says, well, that happens when all of a sudden the energy shifts from the frontal lobe to the parietal, and then so they have various kinds of, but what they're basically saying is that this thing that we're shooting for, that we say samadhi is a real thing, but it's something that's happening in our brain. What? So what could be happening in meditation? What does enlightenment mean if it's not having the brain experience? Remember, because according to Sankhya, that's still prakriti, right? It's like a twitch in your knee. It's much more dramatic. It's awesome, but it's still that. So, what could enlightenment be if it's not that? And it would be great to have that. And I'm not saying anybody should not have it. And if it happens naturally as part of your meditation, that's awesome. Embrace it. But what is enlightenment? I think really, at least as far as I'm concerned, it's that this world that we live in, this world that's all around us, none of it is the way that we think that it is. And this isn't just a philosophical point of view. It's the science. We're all viewing the world. I mean, a guy like Bernardo Kastrup, or Donald Hoffman or David Chalmers, they would say that our minds basically create the world that we have around us. Now, is that valuable information? For most people, not so. It doesn't matter to me whether my mind creates it or whether that's the way it really is. I got to live with what I got here, so I'm going to work with it, But it's all reality is kind of a heuristic, by which I mean it's not really the way it is, but I'm going to act as if it is because that's what works, So this world is all comes to us through these filters. We're basically, as Bernardo Kastrup says, we're basically navigating with instruments, like being in an airplane where you can't see anything. Everything is readings, except the readings are this world that we perceive it to be. So nothing is that way. What I think meditation is able to do is it's able to take us down to a point of stillness where we're able to let those filters drop a bit. Able to get into something more like the state that the woman who wrote Stroke of Insight, if we can just let those filters go, we begin to, is it something that's more real? Well, that's a question. Can you ever get out of the brain or just have different kind of brain experiences? And because they're different, you think that they're more real. Maybe they're just a different kind of unreal. But whatever they are, you can have those experiences, and meditation will lower those filters. So the idea is that if you lower those filters enough through a regular practice over and over again, what one of my teachers, Forrest Knudsen, calls the samadhi therapy. If you do that often enough, when you go around the world, when you're going around in the regular world after meditation, you take a certain amount of that awareness with you. You realize that what you're seeing around here is coming to you through a kind of filter of perception and all these kinds of things. And it kind of changes the way you engage in the world. And if the Sankhya people are right about the idea that that even the mind is part of the physical universe, then whatever it is that's outside the physical universe is absolutely undescribable in language. So everything you say about what this is, what I'm saying, what you're saying, what anybody's saying, they're all a kind of a story. Not in a bad way. I mean, this Joseph Campbell kind of says this with regard to myth. They're all a kind of story because we need to say something. And so nothing is ever actually more right than something else. These are all, and it's kind of the ultimate of relativism, but it's, nothing is ever sort of more right than anything else. They're all just ways we have of describing, if we've had that experience like this, they're ways we've had of describing something that cannot ultimately be described. So they're all just kind of compromised, and they all differ from each other. Hildegard von Bingen from Ramana Maharshi or Yogananda or whatever. And so what does meditation do for you? I think it allows you to drop the filters as much as possible. Experience whatever it is you experience when that happens, most of which you cannot really describe to anybody who hasn't had a similar experience. And then it's after enlightenment, carry water, cut wood. Now you're back again. And you can romanticize it and say, I see God everywhere. But the fact is, what you basically see is an awareness that I'm viewing everything through filters and thinking it all through a mind with limited ability to touch the real. And that's almost a different way of saying the same thing, but it's much less romantic. It's much more pragmatic and everyday. When it happens, maybe it isn't what you thought it would be. Maybe what we all hope enlightenment is going to be is a little bit more like the stories in Yogananda's book. But when the real thing happens, it turns out it's not really dramatic in those kinds of ways. It all seems natural. You wonder why you didn't see it that way before. It's not like anything's changed. It's just like you've just seen it for what it is. So I don't know, we're all striving. Everything I say, if you follow my point of view, is a story. I'm just telling a story about the way I see things, and I think that's what everybody else is doing too. You do the meditation, you try to get the most unfiltered view of what this whole thing is, and you just go with what you get.
Mm-hmm. And to the point about the brain, I teach a classical spiritual care. We read a book, The Awakened Brain by Lisa Miller, in which she talks about the neuroscience behind spirituality. She started by studying mental health. And it so happens that the more we develop our spiritual capacities, the less prone we are to mental illness. Yeah. The more protected we are against mental illness, the more we have resilience to cope with mental illness. And she also says our brain actually changes. The neural circuits we use change, and even structurally changes. Yeah. But the point you were making about there's a shift. Now we experience oneness. And so the part of the brain that would be active in telling us this is the border of my being, and this is me, and this is the rest of the world, that switches to something else. And now we begin to experience oneness. Yeah. And so to me, to read that, and I think, that the sense that I am a separated being is actually produced by a way the brain works, and the brain can work another way.
That's right. Yeah, it's produced by evolution because it's efficient.
Yeah, it's efficient, right? We needed it.
So when the brain goes into that mode and drops that filter, does that mean? I mean, again, these are all stories that we're telling, but does that mean that in the real world, there isn't an end to where you are and where the world is, but that's just something that's a filter that makes it possible for whatever it is this body is, if it's not something, so are you seeing something the way it really is, or are you seeing it just as a kind of mode of perception, which could be another, or is the whole idea the way it really is the wrong idea? There is no the way it really is. That's also a construction.
Right, because in as much as we remain embodied and we are perceiving through the body, through the brain, using the brain, regardless of whether it is caused by the brain or correlated or induced in the brain by some other change that happens beyond the brain, we're still perceiving through the brain.
Right.
And whatever story we tell, it is being filtered.
And it may seem like the ultimate cop-out. People could be reading this and watching us, and they could be saying, well, gosh, isn't this just like how many angels dance on the head of a pin? What are you talking about here? Does any of this make any difference? And there could be some sort of hardcore scientists will say, well, all you're really talking about, and I've got scientific. Well, you know what? As far as I'm concerned, and this again, I know this sounds like a cop-out. That's a story too. It's just the story you like, and I got the story I like, and you got the story you like. But they're all stories, because this is just a physical mind here, and whatever really is past this mind, none of us can really express. So we're all just trying. So just because yours is science and yours is theology and yours is worship, there's nothing that makes any of them any better. They're all just they're all ways of coping with this physical existence.
Yeah. And it's like saying, let's argue about this thing that cannot be argued about. That cannot be talked
spend
about.
a couple thousand years doing it and killing each other. Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that.
So how would you say in your case? So for instance, I could say in my case, having done in whatever form spiritual practices in the last 15, 20 years, I have a greater sense of, I see more beauty, I see more love, I experience more love, I experience more space in my own life, like a spaciousness. I don't feel as, how would I, my vision is not as tunnel vision, I would say. There's more room. What have you noticed these decades of practice? How has it transformed you?
Well, I would say that when my practice it's only been in the last several years that meditation has been a big part of my practice. Up to that point, I was more of a sort of jnani type, So there it was all about, thinking about these issues and trying to figure out the way things are. And well, that was quite rewarding in a lot of kinds of ways. And I think it did help me to be more sort of on an even keel most of the time. I would say the bigger changes have happened when I really sort of stepped up the meditation discipline over the last several years. And in that case, I would say the biggest pragmatic benefit is that I react much less. It's harder to get a reaction out of me emotionally to things that happen, good or bad, actually. And when I react, the reactions are not as intense as they used to be, and things don't stick. So I think maybe you've experienced the same thing. One of the things I think you get is this ability to return back to the steady state much more quickly. And maybe, 5 years from now, I won't be able to be budged from this steady state. But, something happens, somebody cuts me off, it's like, ah. But then, like 30 seconds later, I'm done. I'm thinking about something else. It's all fine. Whereas, me 10 or 15 years ago would have been like thinking about it for like an hour and telling my wife about it when I got home. Now I'm like, it's good. But so it's not like I don't react. But when it happens, it just doesn't stick. So maybe that's a bit of the equanimity that people talk about, happening. It's just, the part of it that personally is a little bit more difficult, I think, to deal with, or that you didn't expect, is that things don't upset you as much, but things also don't excite you as much. That's the other side of it. You can't just have all the intense excitement and then none of it. Like, once you're on an even keel, you're on an evener keel with all things. And that takes a little getting used to. You wonder, is something wrong? But no, that's just the way it is. Good things happen. Awesome. Next. Bad things happen. Terrible. Next. But it's always that same sort of cycle. There's still things that can get my goat for longer periods of time than that, I will admit.
Is there so some may interpret that as saying as being withdrawal from life of sorts, or do you feel like it's a fuller engagement with life?
I do think there is an element of withdrawal. I mean, one thing we haven't touched on, and we've already run up quite a bit of clock time here, is what happens when you dedicate yourself to not suppressing but releasing the ego, and what ends up happening there. And you begin to find out that some of the things, if it's not about you or glorifying you or your reputation, especially professionally or whatever like that, you know, as a performer, as a scholar, whatever, if it's not about that, you're almost disappointed in yourself to find out that a lot of the motivation you thought was about those things, turns out was about glorifying your ego. Mm-hmm. And now you just cannot find it in yourself to do those things anymore, because you're not dedicated to that glorification of the ego thing anymore. It's like, well, if that's the case, why the heck do this? You know? And I don't know if you've experienced this. One thing I say, I'm not sure this is right for everybody. It's one thing for me to say as a full professor at the end of my career, you know, all that kind of thing. But, you know, for someone who's in their 30s or 40s, all of a sudden lose that drive, it would lead to stasis, and that would probably not lead to a good place. But that kind of a change is pretty drastic, where all of a sudden the things you were engaged with before are in many cases not very interesting to you at all, because you realize not that I was engaged in them for the wrong reasons, but those reasons no longer appeal to me anymore. So is that a retreat? I don't know. I'm not really quite sure it is, but I'm sure you could see it that way. I wouldn't say flat affect, but it's tougher to rile you either way, you know, and certain kinds of things that used to be so ego-driven and ambitious about, you no longer care so much about. You know, I would rather teach a couple of students meditation than give a conference paper, you know. I'd rather do this than have a publication, you know. I mean, those are all things that if you had come to me 10 years ago and said, I said, that's crazy. That's crazy talk. But that's what happens. Yeah, maybe it's age. Maybe you just get burned out. Who knows? Who's to know whether it's the natural aging process or the practice that's making the difference? But something's happening.
Mm-hmm. And where do things like beauty, love, joy, how do they fit in?
Well, in the same kinds of ways that they always did. I mean, you know, in the fall. I was in the Himalayas, and man, what can you say? You know, you get up about 9,000 feet. You know, we were in Badrinath, you know, and then there's a little town just up from there where the different caves are. You know, it's just absolutely fantastic. How can you not be taken up with the beauty of all of that? Yeah, sure. All of that is great. I listen to music. It's beautiful. It's fantastic, and all that. Yeah, I mean that's all still there. None of that has gone away. I guess what's just gone away is there's no element in which I think about how having experienced that, or knowing something about this music, or having recognized something about it while I'm listening to it, is something that I can use to my advantage to advance myself. When previously I'd always been in the mode of like, you know, well, man, you know, I can use this, and I could write a paper, and then maybe I could do this in my course. It's just like, no, it's just awesome. It can just be awesome. I don't have to use it for anything. It can just be. That's a little bit of a different appreciation.
Yeah, for its own sake, it's not a utilitarian value for something else.
Yeah, it can be, and just be. And I don't have to do anything except that be with it.
Mm-hmm. And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this question as we close. How, if you do, but if you don't, also, how can others use music as a way of meditation?
Well, for me, I find that music is not very good, because as a musician, it's just another distraction. In other words, I'm listening. I start to think about the music and all the ways that musicians think about music. I think for others, music can be so. If you're not, a musico and distracted and thinking about music. I mean, I'm thinking about music all the time when there's no music playing. But I think finding. I would think that for meditation purposes, that's something very calming. You can get you can get drones on YouTube that play for like 2 hours. That just and not so much that you're listening to it, as much as it's creating an environment that encourages you to. Environment makes a big difference. Set and setting, as they say. Just kind of release it, let go and release into it. That's the way I would do it. If you're a bhakti, then music plays a different role. Then it gets you all riled up, and that's what you're going for. For a meditation, you're trying to get something that kind of aids you in the sort of winding down, So even something as most Westerners would think that like Ravi Shankar's music was that way, but you know what? It's hard not to get engaged with what Ravi's doing. He's always like, wow, you're trying to meditate. And so, well, that was fantastic what he did there. All of a sudden you're out of the meditation and you're into the Ravi land, so.
I guess I am, I know next to nothing about the technicalities of music and music theory or any of that. So I can just, I can do the meditation. I can just be there. Yeah.
I mean, when I was in college, people study to music.
Yeah.
Let that music on when they're studying. And I've read these, the books, the different books about brain function and all that kind of thing. I can't have music on when I'm studying. It'd be like I'm trying to study and you're talking at me at the same time. It's like I'm trying to pay attention. It's got to be quiet. That's any music, even if it's in the distance or in somebody else's room or whatever. So I can hear that music. I'm listening to it. I'm trying to figure out what is that, a 1 chord, a 5 chord? Is that, you got playing a Stratocaster there? Have all these sort of thoughts, You can't help
so interesting. That was not the answer I was expecting. But it makes sense. It turns on your analytical mind. It turns on the scholar in you.
Which I've been living with all my life.
Yeah.
So every time a piece of music is on, it's about, you can't help it. It's like, I suppose if there was somebody who did buildings or something, an architect or something, they come into your office and you see a beautiful row of shelves and I look at all the colorful books, book spines and titles and all that. And all they see are like, well, let me see, is there a stud there? And there's this, how are they supporting the weight here? They can't help it. That's just the way their minds go.
Yeah. Well, great. Is there anything that you would like to say to close to the listeners?
No, I'm delighted that you've had me. Thank you very much for that. I just urge everybody, meditation is a great thing. If you can do just a little bit of it every day, don't get tied up in which different technique that you use. Just do some meditation. It can't hurt, even if it's for stress relief. Don't forget that meditation is not a no pain, no gain kind of thing. Whenever you do meditation, everything you do should be easy. It should be natural. You should never push yourself. You should never sit in meditation any longer than you feel comfortable sitting in meditation. You're not doing yourself a favor by sitting longer than you're comfortable sitting. And just make it a little part of every day. And of course, if you develop a practice, then of course, more and more a part of every day. But for me, I think I'm a great advocate of meditation. You can find tons of stuff on the internet, people teaching all kinds of things. There are apps. It doesn't really matter what you do. Just start doing something and do a little bit of it every day and see if that helps. And if it does, do more.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your insight, your experiences, and your wisdom. It's been a delight. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Mm-hmm.